you're not expected to be this world-renowned expert in the brain or in the nervous system. That's the first thing you have to understand. You don't have to be, it's not like you have to memorize every single little fact about the brain. You're not expected to be a medical doctor who knows every minute part of the brain, or you don't have to be a neuroscientist. Really, it's just a number of parts of the brain you have to memorize. And the truth of the matter is, if they really expected you to know all the ins and outs of the functions of the brain, you could spend 2 or 3 years of AP Psych trying to explain just that, and it would be rather difficult for people to do. So really, it's very oversimplified. So it should not be as scary to some people as it should, as some people should think of it. Obviously, yes, there's stuff to know, there's stuff to remember, and maybe it doesn't flow in the same way as learning about a famous war battle or something like that. But nevertheless, it's not as bad as some might think about it. So we are going to, but I'm going to start off here. I'm going to start with parts of the brain, major parts of the brain, and then go into the endocrine system. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to chime in. Right now we have 2 live attendees. Pardon me. So the what we're going to start off with here, just making sure, and just want to make sure, can everyone hear me? Just want to make sure is people who are signed on, if you're able to hear me, and if you're able to chime in, I want to make sure you can see the screen, because it started off literally with just me, and I just make sure that other people are hearing me. Maybe you are, maybe not. I hope so. So like I said, we're going to start with parts of the brain, and again, they're oversimplified here. They are relatively oversimplified, and actually, to be truthful, so oversimplified that it really doesn't do justice to the nature of what the brain does. A certain part of the brain does X, Y, and Z, and you learn about X, and you tell someone who's an expert in the brain, well, I learned about the brain doing this, and they're going to tell you, yeah, that's true, but there's a lot more. So again, we're going to stick to with very basic ideas. So I'm going to start off with the first part of the brain, which is the medulla. Okay, and by the way, these images here that I have up here are essentially there so that I know that there's other terms on there, and actually I'm going to reuse some of these images. So, and so we're going to start with the medulla here, and of course just trying to make sure I can see it here. Okay, so the medulla is this thing here in purple on this image, and its primary function is to basically help us live. It helps with for our heart to beat, for us to breathe, circulation. It is the one part of the brain that if it's damaged, it can be very life-threatening. It's interesting because a person could sustain damage in the front of their brain or the top of their brain, and you might think, oh my gosh, that's going to be have a major impact, and it could, but it might not necessarily be life-threatening. However, if there is damage to the medulla, that can be rather problematic. So it's here it is at the base of the brain. It's actually kind of connects the brainstem to the actual brain itself, or I should say it's on the brainstem, connects the spinal cord to the brain. It sometimes is referred to as the medulla oblongata, which I'm not exactly pronouncing correctly, but that's okay. But nevertheless, here it is in this purple region here. It's in charge of basic life functions, as it were. So, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going kind of in order of how, I should say kind of in order of the brain, start from the top going up, not exactly, but more or less in that fashion. So the next thing up here is the pons. And the pons is sleep and arousal. And obviously it does other things too, but for our purposes, I think when it comes to the AP exam, the pons is in charge of sleep regulation and waking you up, basically falling asleep and waking up. It's like this big, actually this was not quite totally accurate here, but it's more or less this big round thing right here is the pons, and this pink. It's not, I'd say the front part is more of the pons than the back part, but it's that kind of pinkish looking thing there. I know some psych teachers, as myself included, we sometimes like to think about as a mnemonic, sleeping by the pond, sleeping by the pond, sleeping by the pond. It's one way of knowing how to memorize the Pons, as it were. So we've had the medulla, which is basic life functions, and now the Pons, which is, pardon me, sleep and arousal. Next thing we're talking about here is, the reticular formation. Now, it's not labeled here, but the reticular formation is actually located behind the Pons. I would say where the I know my arrows, you can't see my arrow here, but it basically, whereas if the Pons is the roundish part and the pink part in the back is where the reticular formation is. It's located behind the Pons. It helps the Pons with sleep and arousal. So it kind of, with the Pons, does the same function, or helps the Pons do the same function. It helps us also pay attention by filtering out irrelevant stimuli. Now, what do I mean by that? So right now, you are hopefully looking at this presentation using your ears and your eyes, and there might be sounds coming from about you. So, for example, in my house, there's a fish tank in the other room that I could hear. I can hear the sound of the refrigerator over here. But because I'm focused on this, my reticular formation helps me filter out those stimuli so I don't have to be bothered by them. So it's that, in that respect, it really helps with basically paying attention by filtering out that irrelevant stimuli. Because if we didn't have it, we would be processing all these things at once, and we wouldn't function as a society if that were to happen. So it doesn't work all too well for that. So that's the reticular formation. Next up is the cerebellum. And I know this is a moving GIF. It was the best one I could find that would be easily allowable for this presentation here. But it's that thing in red. It's basically at the back of the brain. It's the one in red there. It's not red in real life, but it has a number of interesting functions. First off, it helps with keeping us balanced. The ability to walk a straight line, the ability to stand on one foot and not fall over is the purpose of the cerebellum. It also assists with fine motor movements. When I say fine motor movements, holding a pencil is a fine motor movement because it requires me to move my hand in a very precise location. It requires me to pardon me, move my hand in such a way that it has to be very precise. Same thing with typing on the phone, on the cell phone. If you use the keyboard or the keypad or whatever, and you have to use your fingers in a certain way to type, that's a fine motor movement. Plucking the strings of a guitar is another fine motor movement. Being able to do this, for example, touching your nose with your fingers, a fine motor movement. And they're called fine motor movements because, for example, waving my arm is considered to be a gross motor movement, meaning it's not very precise, it's a very big movement, but to do very precise things like this is a fine motor movement. So that's why police officers, if they are testing for the potential of driving while intoxicated, let's say a person may have been drinking alcohol, they've been pulled over, they may test them to see if they have been drinking because the cerebellum is greatly affected by alcohol. So these fine motor movements, they might have you touch your nose like this during such a test, because if the cerebellum is impaired, pardon me, it'd be difficult for you to touch your nose. Also, to keep your balance, walking a straight line is also part of one of those sobriety tests. The cerebellum also helps with procedural memory, which means how to do things. Literally anything you know how to do is largely processed or largely stored in the cerebellum. How to type at a keyboard, how to kick a soccer ball, how to walk, how to drive a car, to an certain extent, the movements associated with driving the car would be associated with the cerebellum. Now, the way I remember this is that I think of my good friend Cerebellum, get it, who is not very well coordinated. She might fall over, she loses her balance, it doesn't work out well for her. Again, that's how I might remember it. It's one of those take it or leave it. So next thing we're talking about here is the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is associated primarily with most memory formations. Now, when I say most, not all memories, but many of them. For example, it doesn't help us with the cerebellum or with the procedural memories, how to do things as much, because that's more of the cerebellum. But in terms of semantic memories, such as the memory of facts, or episodic memories, which might be the memories of things that have happened in your past, those would be stored through the hippocampus. I like to talk about Camp Hippo, where memories are made. It's a very memorable Camp Hippo. Again, that's one of those things that works for me and my students. If it works for you, that's good too. There was an interesting case study of a man by the name of H.M. I knew him as H.M. when I was in college. We now know his name, I think, is Henry Meliason. I might be mispronouncing his name. He died around 2005 or so, approximately. What happened was in the 1950s, he was having severe seizures. And to make a very long story short, someone came up with the idea that if they removed the hippocampus, that it would stop the seizures. Well, fast forward to doing the procedure, to which he consented, I should say. They just didn't force this on him. It did pretty much stop the seizures, almost completely, but he could not make new memory. Now think about this. Unable to make new memory. Old memories are intact, but the inability to make new memory. So that I could be talking to you and I look away, and because I'm talking to you here and I'm trying to make new memories are being stored in my brain saying, hey, I'm having this presentation, I've covered X, Y, and Z. I have the hippocampus to allow me to do that. But if my hippocampus isn't there and I look away, well, now it doesn't get into the other parts of my brain, sometimes referred to as the association areas, that could store that memory. So essentially, I would lose all memory of having this presentation or doing this presentation because I didn't have my hippocampus. So the hippocampus helps with most memory formation. It was interesting that H.M. lived for about 50 more years with this, and there's a lot of interesting stories about a lot of interesting findings because he became a well-known case study. And one thing that was interesting about H.M. was that he could not make new memories, such as I'm talking to you, I look away, and suddenly I can't keep track of the fact that I was just talking to you. One of his favorite shows was All in the Family, which was a show that was on in the 1970s. It was a very popular show. And what was neat about that show is that, what's neat about this is that show came on in the 70s, about 20 years after his surgery. And yet when the show came on, he could recognize some of the characters on the show. But how is that possible? Well, it's perhaps because it was such a funny show, and it was the number one show throughout most of the 1970s. Maybe that what would happen is maybe there was some other part of his brain, in addition to the cerebellum, that might be storing memories, especially ones that might have very strong emotions. Enter the amygdala. The amygdala helps with emotions and emotional memory, so that it helps us with essentially, think about, for example, a strong memory that has an emotion attached to it: love, hate, happiness, joy, sadness, anger, whatever it might be. Well, as it turns out, the amygdala processes that. This is why sometimes when thinking about a memory that had a strong emotion can sometimes bring out that emotion. That's why sometimes talking about or having a memory, or I should say being in an emotional state, like being very angry, you might start remembering other times when you were that angry. And it's because the amygdala in this case is in a way helping you access those memories. Now with HM, it could just be that, well, you know what? The show was so funny, it was so amazing, that it was so laughable that the amygdala actually processed some of the memory, especially in place of the hippocampus, which wasn't there to store most of his memories that he could have made. So that's the amygdala. I think about my good friend Amy G. Dalla, my friend Amy G. Dalla, a very emotional friend. It's just one way I might remember it. So my students use that as well. Next, the amygdala is right about, let's make sure I'm keeping track here. It's this purple thing. It's this bottom purple thing here. On the AP exam, they will not ask you, well, let's put it this way, you do need to know approximately where these parts of the brain are. So what do I mean by that? they might say, what part of the brain is this? Now, they might, say have this. They wouldn't give you, they probably wouldn't, I should say, give you as options ones that are very, very close to it. They would give you ones that are definitely not the answer. They might give you this and Pons, which is down here, cerebellum, which is down here, pancreas, which is not even in the brain, and a few other possibilities that would tell you that's not the answer. So if you know that approximately the amygdala is located somewhere in the middle of the brain, that should be sufficient. So they do expect you to know that. So the next thing here is the hypothalamus, and in this image here, they have the hypothalamic nuclei, which basically points to one major part of the hypothalamus. It's, again, roughly about here. And the hypothalamus is known for its 5 Fs. The 5 Fs, well-known in psychology, well-known in AP Psych, they are feeding. In this case, it helps with the regulation of hunger and satiation. Fighting, which kind of relates to that fight or flight response as part of the sympathetic nervous system, where one's emotions might get enraged, especially in an emergency where I need to fight. I need to fight off something. Something's really wrong. Something's really bad. Something where I need to fight it off. I need to, whatever thing is threatening, I have to get rid of it. I have to take care of it. Now, if I can't, maybe I'm going to instead flee. So fleeing is another thing. Fleeing is where I run away from it. I can't fight it, so I go away. I run away. Again, it's called a fight or flight response. Sometimes that sympathetic nervous system, when there's an emergency, how do I deal with it? Well, fight or flight is part of the hypothalamus, or I should say it's regulated in part through the hypothalamus. Fahrenheit, the reason why they use Fahrenheit is because it helps with body regulation, or I should say temperature regulation. The temperature of the body helps keep the body not too hot, not too cold. Given the situation that you're in, given the surroundings that you're in, it helps keep the body at a good temperature. So if it's hot outside, you will start to sweat to help cool down the body. If it's cold out, you might shiver or do something else to generate heat so that you are preserving heat so you don't get too cold. So it helps with temperature regulation. And the 5th F being mating. Well, now we might say that doesn't start with an F. I think you know exactly where that's going. But nevertheless, many textbooks like to throw that in there. It helps obviously with the reproductive system, so that when people wish to reproduce, or when an organism wishes to reproduce, the hypothalamus plays a large role in this. Now, if you know something about the sympathetic nervous system, what's interesting is that all these things tend to correlate quite well. So that if there is an emergency, your fight or flight system is activated. Your hunger is suppressed, because after all, in an emergency, the last thing you want to be thinking about is food. Your body temperature might go up or down depending upon the situation that you're in, and your reproductive urges go down during an emergency as well. So they're all basically interrelated, and that's in part because of the hypothalamus that regulates all those 5 Fs, as they're called. So the hypothalamus, the 5 Fs, if you remember those, that will help you quite a bit. So the next thing here is the thalamus, which is right above the hypothalamus. It has sometimes referred to as the relay system. It takes all the sensory input, with the exception of smell. It takes what I see, what I hear, what I taste, what I touch, and it relays it to other parts of the brain. So I see something, goes through my eyes, eventually through the visual receptor sites of my eyes, goes to the thalamus. Thalamus says, okay, this is going to go to the occipital lobe. So basically, that's the function, the primary function of the thalamus. It does all those functions with the exception of smell. Why smell? It has to do probably with the evolutionary adaptation of needing to survive, and smell is our first system to tell us that something might be wrong. And so it actually goes through a more direct system called the olfactory bulb. But that has been asked in the AP exam before, which of the senses does not go through the thalamus, and that would be the sense of smell does not go through the thalamus. So, and again, for those of you who are here, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Of course, I made the mistake of making sure my chat was off site. Now it's back. Okay. Again, if anyone's there, I'm just going to say hello again on the chat. Oh, it doesn't allow me a duplicate message, so I'll just do this. feel free to ask any questions. Because we teachers, we do like questions. We really do. As long as they're legitimate, actual questions, obviously. So, all right. So now we're going to talk about the lobes of the brain. And lobes of the brain is referred to as the cerebral cortex. Essentially different parts of the brain, different areas of the brain. Once upon a time, when we started studying the brain, we saw that they were different anatomical regions. They were almost in a way, they were regioned rather naturally and nicely. And so we just called them this function, that function, or this lobe, this lobe, this lobe, and this lobe. And it worked quite well. Well, as it turns out, each of these lobes have specific functions. And again, this is probably the most oversimplified part of, well, not the most, but one of the most oversimplified parts of this presentation is that these lobes, the 4 lobes are part of the cerebral cortex, frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital, do a lot more than what I'm about to tell you, but these are the major things that you learn. And then if you go into brain research, if you go into neuroanatomy, if you go into neuroscience or into medicine, you will build on your knowledge on that. But so the frontal lobe, which makes the most sense, it's in the front, is in charge of movement and decision making, among other things. But the big things here is movement in the front of the head. And then the very front, the prefrontal cortex, is where most of our executive functioning is made, our decision making, our ability to evaluate, our ability to weigh options, our ability in a way to think critically in means of trying to make a decision or come to a solution. The frontal lobe does a lot of that. So it's this part of the brain right here. Obviously, the frontal lobe makes the most sense there. The parietal lobe, located approximately here, that's in charge of the sense of touch. Again, does a lot more. Something called the somatosensory cortex is located in the parietal lobe. That appeared about 2 or 3 years ago in the AP exam, and some taught parietal lobe, but they didn't teach the somatosensory cortex. Eventually, or essentially, it refers to making sense, no pun intended, making sense of the sense of touch, where your hand-eye coordination, so I'm feeling this, I'm feeling the table, I'm feeling my computer here, and I'm processing this and knowing where things are. The somatosensory cortex does a lot of that. Temporal lobe, or temporal lobe, is the sense of hearing. Again, these lobes do a lot more than just this, but in terms of the AP exam, they talk about the temporal lobe being in charge of hearing. I know some of your teachers might teach you a little bit more, but that's, for me, what I would leave it at for now, at least in AP Psych. Again, maybe in AP Bio, they go into a little bit more specific. But still, I would stick with that for hearing, with the temporal lobe. The occipital lobe, this one makes no sense at all. Now, I don't know if you believe in God or evolution, both, neither, whatever. Whatever it is that made us, it had a very strange sense of humor. Because the occipital lobe helps us with the sense of sight. My eyes are right here. Now, if whatever made us wants to make a system that's very efficient, where should the sense of sight be? Where in the brain should it process the sense of sight? Well, it should be maybe in the frontal lobe or something like that. No! Again, whatever that made us had a sense of humor because it's actually located in the back of the brain. It's located in the back of the head, the occipital lobe. So it literally goes through my eyes and then crosses over the optic nerves and the optic chiasm, more about that in sensation and perception, and eventually through my thalamus, which goes to my occipital lobe. Okay, like I said, whatever it made us had a sense of humor. It's not very efficient, but that's the way it works. And sometimes you will get a question in the AP exam where it might say, Bob got hit in the back of the head. Actually, I think this actually appeared one year. Maybe 99. Bob got hit in the back of the head. He will have difficulty doing what? And the answer would be, I think the answer might have been making decisions, hearing, touching things, and seeing was one of the answers, which is also the correct answer. So that's what the occipital lobe does. So those are the things you should look at when you study what do each of these lobes do. Okay, Broca's area is, some textbooks say this is in the parietal lobe, others kind of put it in the frontal lobe. I put, there's no laws to where Broca's area is because it's a little debated as to where its exact location is. As a matter of fact, there are some people who can say that Broca's area is just incorrect altogether. But I would say it's more of a frontal lobe function and maybe parietal. I don't think the AP exam would ever give you the option or would ever ask you where it is and then give you both of those as an option. But I would say it's more frontal than parietal, though I have taught both. Broca's area is located approximately right here in the left hemisphere. In the left hemisphere only. And this is very important. It's in the left hemisphere, the left part of your brain, left frontal or parietal lobe, and it has to do with language production. Not just speech production, but language production, the ability to speak, the ability to write, the ability to express oneself in terms of language is regulated through Broca's area. A person who might have a stroke and have Broca's area damaged might have something called Broca's aphasia, where the person can understand quite well, but they would have literal difficulty expressing themselves in terms of language, in terms of speaking and writing. Maybe they can use facial expressions. Maybe they can use body language. Perhaps, actually, that too can be limited. But still, when we talk about overall language production, it can be severely limited when one has Broca's aphasia, when Broca's area is damaged. Now, the other thing, also in the left hemisphere, is Wernicke's area. Now, Wernicke's area is, I'd say, just the textbooks are pretty, are fairly universal about this, that it's located in the temporal lobe, although some of this looks a little parietal in this image here. But, pardon me again, I would say, again, temporal lobe is the most likely answer. Again, it's in the left hemisphere, left temporal lobe, and this has to do with language comprehension, the ability to comprehend a language. So the fact is that you can understand me. I hope I'm coming across clearly, and assuming so, that you could understand what I am saying. Maybe not every single word, but more or less you're understanding what I'm saying. That is because your Wernicke's area allows you to do that. Now, what's interesting is that for me to speak, to actually move my mouth and speak words, I need Broca's area, which I believe is working just fine. But in order for me to make sense, in order for me to talk, then there is Wernicke's area. Because if a person has Wernicke's aphasia, again, really oversimplifying a bit here, a person who has damage to Wernicke's area, they might be able to speak just fine, assuming there's no damage to Broca's area, but they might speak in a kind of almost a word salad or sentences that don't make sense. And I don't want to give you examples because I couldn't do it well, and I don't want to make it seem like I'm mocking anyone who has it. But essentially, you might ask them a question like, "How are you doing?" And they might start answering in a random series of sentences that have nothing to do with what you're asking, because they have difficulty comprehending what you're saying, and they're also having difficulty expressing themselves in a way that can be understood. So it's a strange. When I say strange, I mean not that people who are experiencing it are strange, but it's a strange phenomenon when that happens. So understand the difference between Broca's and Wernicke's area. Broca's is speech production, or actually language production, compared to Wernicke's area, which is language comprehension. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat. So this now brings me to the endocrine system. The endocrine system is in many ways not connected, but does interact with the brain. Obviously, the whole body interacts with itself. But with the endocrine system, whereas the brain, we often think about neurons and neurotransmitters in the nervous system, the endocrine system is more of blood chemicals, hormones, which could also be neurotransmitters too, but basically the rest of the body. So again, there's the endocrine system, much like the brain. There is a lot to it. There's a whole bunch to it. But again, we're only going to stick to a number of parts here. So the first thing we're talking about I have here is the pituitary gland. Now, I should say that I should include here that the hypothalamus is kind of like the owner of the pituitary gland, or sorry, the owner of the endocrine system. It is what is totally in charge. It says, okay, this part of the endocrine system do this, and that part of the endocrine system do that. So whereas the hypothalamus in a way is the owner, the pituitary gland is sort of the manager. It's the manager that's kind of regulated by the owner. Owner says, okay, pituitary gland, you do this. So the pituitary gland, pardon me, is kind of considered to be the master gland because it's kind of the one that manages the rest of the endocrine system. All the blood hormones that go through our body regulate primarily through the pituitary gland. Also, the pituitary gland helps us with growth, the ability for us to actually literally grow. If you are a professional wrestling fan, which not many people were like they were in the 1980s, or if you've ever seen the movie The Princess Bride, then you might be familiar with someone who had a very overactive pituitary gland. His name was Andre the Giant. Andre the Giant was a professional wrestler turned actor who had a very overactive pituitary gland, and where essentially he grew very too quickly. Now, I think he was over 7 feet tall. I can't remember, but he was very, very big. And you might say, well, that's really cool to be really big. Well, it comes with a number of health complications, one of them being that the heart does not pump as well as it should. And unfortunately, at the rather young age of, I believe, 46, he died because of congestive heart failure, because his heart was basically too big, more or less. Now, for people who have this particular condition, there are treatments that can stop the growth or stunt the growth so you don't grow to be too tall. I'm pretty sure of that last time I checked. But yeah, it's just one of those things. The pituitary gland's in charge of growth, along with being the master gland. So some of these other glands that we talk about here. One is the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is literally located right here in the throat. And it releases a hormone, I don't have it on here, I apologize for that, called thyroxine. And what it does is, among other things, again, this does a lot of different things. It helps with, pardon me, our metabolism. Essentially, the keeping our caloric intake going so that we're burning calories. A person with an overactive thyroid might, among other things, having too much thyroxine that can might speed up your metabolism, but that also can cause a number of other health problems too. But essentially, the thyroid, which releases thyroxine, helps regulate the body's metabolism. The adrenal glands allow us to, they are basically located right about here, and they release something called adrenaline or epinephrine, which is chemically similar to norepinephrine, which you might have learned about in the brain unit or in the neuron unit. It's a neurotransmitter. And among other things, it helps us with emergency energy. So that in an emergency, the adrenal glands, they will release epinephrine. They also might release something called cortisol, which is another emergency hormone. And what that does is it essentially allows us, again, to function in an emergency. Perhaps you might know someone, or maybe you or someone who has a severe allergy of some kind, and they require an EpiPen. What does that EpiPen do? Well, the EpiPen is epinephrine. It's adrenaline, essentially. So you take a shot of the adrenaline so that the body can help fight off the allergic reaction to whatever might be triggering it. So that's what the adrenal gland does. It gives emergency energy, again, among other things, when there's an emergency. The pineal gland releases a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin is a hormone that helps with the sleep cycle. So not sort of to help fall asleep and to wake up, but essentially keep our sleep cycle in check. So right now here in the East Coast, it's about 7:30 p.m. and maybe about 2 or 3 hours I should be going to bed. I will feel tired. I'll need to go to sleep. And that's because my pineal gland might be releasing melatonin that makes my body feel tired, that says, okay, I need to fall asleep. And maybe around 6, 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, I will wake up. Oh, it's a new day. Great. Hey, good to be here. I'm awake. I'm alive. It's a new day. Wonderful. The pineal gland releases melatonin to help with that regulation, with help with sleep regulation. The pancreas, that assists with glucose regulation, that is the amount of sugar in our body, which is done through the hormone of insulin. So insulin is a hormone that helps make sure that we don't have too much sugar or in our body, and helps if our sugar levels are low, can help us in that situation as well. A person with diabetes, more or less, their pancreas is not able to produce sufficient amounts of insulin. So that's why some people have to have their sugar monitored, their glucose monitored using a glucose meter, and to see how much insulin they might need, because their pancreas might not be able to release enough at that time. So that's what the pancreas does. And finally, we have the gonads, which are the reproductive parts of the endocrine system. And the female sex is ovaries, which release estrogen. And the males, it's the testes, which release androgen. A specific type of androgen is testosterone. It was once thought that females had nothing but estrogen, and males had nothing but testosterone. And I say female and male, I'm talking about female sex and male sex. As it turns out, later research showed that the ovaries do produce small amounts of testosterone, and males and the testes in the males also produce small amounts of estrogen. And so as it turns out, we do have males and females, those the male sex and the female sex, have both hormones in the body. It's just a matter of what predominates at a particular time. So that is what the gonads are. They are the reproductive system. So with that, that is a rundown of the brain and the endocrine system.